there are three pillars to successful sport performance, or for peak performance, right? There's three pillars that performance is based upon. The first pillar is the technical pillar.
Okay.
Right? And so who does that come from?
Coach.
The coaches,
Coach and the
right?
player.
Coaches,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and you know, the training that the kids have gotten, right? That's why we do the drills over and over and over and over again, right?
Sure.
Because doing those drills over and over again, they don't interestingly, they don't just create muscle memory, which we've kind of like all heard of,
Yeah.
but the way that the brain is able to process sensory stimulation and react, our brain starts to really process that at a deeper level. And so what happens is sometimes then when we start thinking about things, it moves it to our frontal lobe, and that then can jam performance. I'm digressing a little bit. We can get into that a little bit more later. But ultimately, the first pillar is the technical pillar.
Okay.
So, for example, you know, swimmers work repeatedly on making sure that they have their technique down, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes, as a golfer, sometimes your technique can get a little bit flawed without you even necessarily knowing it. So then what do? Well, you direct things back to the coach. So if I have an athlete and they have any doubts or, you know, seeds of doubt in the back of their mind as to the technical piece of things, then what do we have to do? Hey, well, then it makes it clear. Okay, we have to go and get this technical piece taken care of. We'll go to your coach and we'll work on your turns because you have doubt in the back of your mind about turns, right? So that's the technical pillar. The second pillar of peak performance is training. Now, training isn't a technical piece. Training is like being in shape, right? The cardiovascular work that we're putting in, right? So it involves outside training. Like every professional athlete has their own personal trainer, right?
Yep.
You know, but not only do they have a personal trainer, they typically also have nutritionists because what we're putting into our body also impacts our training, as well as things like making sure that we're getting adequate rest and sleep.
Right.
You know, so that's the training pillar. And then the third pillar to peak performance is the mental pillar. And that's what I come in and work with athletes on. Now, interestingly, the pillars can tie together because if an athlete has concerns about a technical piece or if they have concerns about their training, understandably, what's that going to do? Well, those seeds of doubt can then explode into anxiety, which then can completely undermine performance.
Sure.
But the mental pillar isn't just anxiety. The mental pillar also gets based upon like attention and focus and emotional regulation. So those are the things that we primarily work on because ultimately when we're looking at levels of athletic development, right? When we're talking about youth athletes, there is a great difference. There's a lot of diversity in terms of their athletic ability and their talent, right?
Absolutely.
As we move towards elite status with athletes, what happens?
Yeah, it narrows.
Right? It narrows, and it narrows greatly, right? Because when you're getting to world-class athletes, all the athletes are fantastic athletes.
Yes.
So what gives them the edge?
Mental.
The mental edge, yeah.
Parents want to know, like, how can I best support my son or daughter?
I mean, understandably, parents are like paramount in the development of a child athlete, right? Absolutely, they are.
Right.
And, you know, I usually suggest you kind of want the middle ground when it comes to your parental support with your child athlete, right? Sometimes we have over-involved parents, right? Like, and that's not to say you can't live vicariously through your child. That's not inappropriate. But if your social status or your like unachieved expectations and goals are getting lived out through your child, or you have such an authoritarian approach to controlling your child and their youth sport development with things, you know, well, that tends to create a lot of pressure on youth athletes then, and anxiety and other things that can, you know, be very detrimental. And then what happens is when there's too much pressure, there's too much anxiety.
Sure.
Kids just, they don't want to do it anymore.
Right.
So there are over-involved parents. Sometimes we also have under-involved parents, right? Parents who don't necessarily actively support their kids. They don't show a lot of interest or enthusiasm in their kids' sports choices, or maybe they want their kid to do another sport, so they, you know, kind of like subtly don't provide as much support or interest or aren't showing up to the games and stuff like that. And what ultimately happens with that? Kids get disheartened by it, right? And then their interest and enthusiasm for the sport starts to wane. I think the most appropriate position is kind of this middle ground, right? Like where we are providing support, and you can certainly be active in terms of promoting like morals and ethics through your child's commitment to their sport. That is absolutely not inappropriate, because it's important that they develop like those skills and tools and understandings for things like sportsmanship and commitment, right? Like that's just important stuff for life. But with the middle ground of parenting, doesn't get into that kind of like authoritarian, controlling, coaching from the sideline approach that can often create anxiety and confusion for kids.
Let's even take coaching from the sideline off the table for a second. Use an example of highly enthusiastic, positive support from the sideline that's continuous. Even that may not be that helpful depending on the situation and the child, right?
It's pretty individualistic and depends on the child and the feedback that you're getting from the child. And if your child is too afraid to provide you feedback, well, there's something going on there.
Sure, that's
right? Because ultimately it's really important. We want our kids to be able to provide us with feedback, be able to understand their own emotion, their experiences, and be able to communicate it to us effectively. That's paramount in relationships. Another thing that I'd like to say in terms of the parenting piece of things is one thing that I really, really believe and support and encourage with the families that I work with is it's really integral for parents to not make sport be the identity of their child, right?
Sure. Yes.
Because ultimately, even so my daughter's an outstanding soccer player. She really is. But, we've never encouraged that her primary identity just be as a soccer player. She has other varied interests. She has friends that aren't on the soccer team and stuff like that. Because ultimately, if your child's primary identity is that of their sport, well, in the vast, vast, vast majority of cases, there's going to be a time when the sport ends.
Right.
Either because it just follows the natural process of ending, or because of injury in many cases as well. And then if sport is the primary identity of the child, they will have a very difficult time carving out additional identity. So it's important for kids to be involved in other things, to have varied interests, even important for kids to play more than one sport.
Yes. Big fan, to get that varied experience, and there's a social element, all of that.
And again, it doesn't have to be just sports. It can be other things as well. It's important that the child doesn't just define themselves in terms of the sport, because as we all know, ultimately there's usually a time when the sport runs its course or injury sets in, and then if the kids don't have varied bases and interests and skills and other pieces to their identity, it's going to be really hard for them.
So when you talk about parents helping their children not use just the sport as their sole identity, what tools might there be? Like, can you give me an example of what parents might be able to do? For example, I've said to other people, that just encourage and support, and these. Is it as simple as that?
Yeah, and sometimes it's tough as a parent. Trust me, I work with families where where the kids can get very, they can dig their heels in about not wanting to do something.
Yes.
And an approach I usually just suggest is, okay, well, it doesn't have to be just this one thing or just what I'm thinking you should do, but we'll put some options out there, and if you don't want to pick one of those, then just pick something for yourself.
Right.
14 is the magic number for kids just playing one sport and focusing year-round on one sport.
Okay, so I can't let that go. Why is that? That's interesting.
Rates of burnout are lower, because when kids start at an early age just playing one sport all year round without varied interest, burnout is huge. Also, the risk for injury is dramatically greater, because kids aren't, they're not developing a comprehensive muscle base with things.